Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be talking about some of my absolute favourite works of historical fiction. So, I have 30 books to tell you about today and in another video soon. I haven't quite decided yet whether I'm going to split this video in two. I think I'm going to see how efficient I can be in my descriptions of books. I was initially trying to get this list of my 30 favourite historical fiction books down to a list of 20, but I couldn't quite manage it. And in the last video I made talking about my favourite kind of historical fiction authors overall, lots of people said they were kind of keen to hear my larger list, so I thought I would just share that. So across this video and possibly another, I'm going to be telling you about some of my absolute favourite works of historical fiction, my absolute favourite historical fiction books. I'm avoiding using the word novel because there is one book on this list that could maybe be considered a short story collection more than a novel, but they probably all do vaguely count as novels. But anyway, I'm being fairly broad in my definition of historical fiction. So all of these books have a pretty big historical element, but there are some books with present day elements as well as historical elements. There are quite a few books with speculative elements, and one book that some people would probably argue is a fantasy novel more than a work of historical fiction, but I would probably argue it's more of a work of historical fiction, so there we go. There are also some books on this list that are not set that far before they were written. I think every book is probably set at least 30-40 years before it was published, but not necessarily a really long time in the past. One of my other sort of parameters for this list is that it is all sort of modern-ish historical fiction. So I think the book published the longest time ago was from the late 1980s. I don't have any classic historical fiction in this list. You know, if I were thinking about my favourite books that were published in a point in time and set in a previous point in time, then Wuthering Heights should probably be on that list. But I kind of wanted to just focus on modern historical fiction rather than on sort of classic historical fiction today. So this is a big list of 30 books, and the ranking is fairly arbitrary. I mean, books 1 to 10 I do love hugely, and even more than books 20 to 30, but the individual ranking isn't very specific. I kept moving books around, and then I thought, you know, it's fine. I love all these books a lot. I will also leave linked down below the video I did last week on my favourite authors of historical fiction, where I spoke about some authors who have written lots of historical fiction, where I love, you know, multiple of their books. I've tried to be relatively restrained with how many books by those authors I included on this list, because I did already speak about them previously, and there are lots of other books I wanted to talk about today. So in kind of narrowing down to a top 30, I excluded quite a few books by those authors. So I think most of those authors, I only have one book by them on this list. There are two authors where I have two books by them on this list because I just couldn't quite eliminate them. But I did want to try and not fill this list just with those authors, because there is so much historical fiction that I have to talk about. Okay, I feel like I've been rambling for a very long time with a very long introduction for what's already going to be a very long video. So let me get into the books. Can I do this in one video? We will find out. So at number 30, I have The Confessions of Franny Langton by Sarah Collins. This is a fantastic, atmospheric, gothic, Jane Eyre vibe novel set in the Georgian period. We're following Franny Langton from her childhood on a slave plantation in Jamaica to her life in Georgian London working as a servant. And we know from the beginning that Franny Langton will be accused of murdering the people that she works for, and we are following her sort of court trial and also looking at what got her to this point. It's fantastic. It's so well written. I highly recommend the audiobook, which is really, really well done. And in general, I just think it's a truly amazing novel. At number 29, we have A Lady's Guide to Scandal by Sophie Irwin. This is a complete delight of a book. It is a wonderful novel set in the Regency period following a young widow who, after the death of her husband, who was a lot older than her, who she was kind of pushed into marrying, she finds herself with new freedom. However, she has inherited all his money on the condition that she doesn't cause any scandal, so she has to be very careful about her behaviour. Meanwhile, the man she was in love with before she was pressured into this marriage comes back into her life. Persuasion vibes going on, but there is also another man who may be gaining her interest. And it's just so good. There's so much about etiquette and behaviour in the Regency period. The main character is an artist, and that element is fascinating. There's so many interesting historical elements, so much great character development, and it's just a real utter joy of a book. At number 28, we have The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton, a massive tome of a book that is absolutely worth your time, that is really fantastic. This is set in 19th century New Zealand and follows various characters who all kind of get drawn together by some mysterious crimes and disappearances. This is a fantastic novel that I absolutely loved reading. I'll be honest, it's been quite a few years since I read The Luminaries, and bits of it have faded from my mind, but I remember having such a glorious time with this book. And although there are certain big elements of the book that I can't remember, there are also a lot of like small details and small scenes that really, really stay with me. And it is a book I still think about from time to time, and it is a book that is fantastically done. There's so much in this book. It's so layered and so wonderful. I think if you love 19th century literature and those kind of like big sprawling books with lots of different threads, then I think you'll really like The Luminaries. It is fantastic. At number 27, I have The Tolstoy Estate by Stephen Conte. This book is set during the Second World War, and it follows a German military doctor who is stationed at a military hospital in Russia during the Second World War, and this hospital is on the grounds of the house where Tolstoy lived. And we follow this military doctor and also his relationship with a Russian woman who is kind of the caretaker of the Tolstoy estate. I thought the Tolstoy estate was just such a fantastic book, and it's one of those ones that has really stayed with me. It's one that I read because it was longlisted for the World Scott Prize for Historical Fiction, and actually looking down this list, there are a lot of books on here that I read because they were on the World Scott Prize for Historical Fiction long list. And the Tolstoy estate is just a fantastic novel, really complex, really interesting, wonderful characterization, and looks really complexly at war and the legacy of war. And yeah, it's just one that has stayed with me a lot and that I would really recommend. At number 26, I have Half-Blood Blues by Etty Adjujan, another novel set during the Second World War and looking at a kind of slightly different aspect of the Second World War. So Half-Blood Blues follows various black jazz musicians living in Europe when the Second World War breaks out. They start off in Germany, they end up in France, and we follow their journey, their relationships, and also the disappearance of one of them and how it continues to haunt the others later on in life. This book is mostly set during the 1930s and 40s, but there is also a kind of like 1990s strand going through it. I love how this book looks at music. I think it looks at war fantastically, and I also think it looks at like an era of the Second World War you don't hear spoken about very much. And I just think it is fantastic. So I really, really recommend this one a lot. At number 25, I have The Queen of Fives by Alex Hay. I read this very, very recently, so I kind of don't know whether this actually belongs further up on this list. It's a bit hard to judge when you've read something so recently, but I thought this was fantastic. The Queen of Fives is a wonderful novel set in the late 19th century following a con artist who is trying to con a fortune out of a duke, and we follow her and the duke and his family and all of the complexities around them. But things are not really what they seem. Everything is very, very twisty and turny. If you like Sarah Waters, you will love Alex Hay, and The Queen of Fives is just like so good. One of those books that I just found like an utter delight, and that just felt like it was so entirely for me. It is so fun, so pacey, absolutely perfectly paced, and just really, really incredible. Talking of incredibly well-paced, twisty-turny books, next I have The Square of Sevens by Laura Shepherd Robinson. Should this book be higher up this list? Possibly. Anyway, The Square of Sevens is a wonderful novel set in the 18th century. It's a coming-of-age story about a girl called Red who spends a lot of her life doing kind of like tarot reading and reading cards for other people, and she ends up, through various circumstances, involved in a very complicated, dramatic legal case. And meanwhile, there is another character we're following, Lazarus Dark, what a name, who may be on the other side to her. I feel like The Square of Sevens is too complicated to explain, but like just know that it is fantastic. It is so twisty and turny and glorious. The characterization is amazing. The sort of crime aspects of the book are fantastic. There's a big legal case, as I said, but there's also theft and murder and so much more. And it's just like such a glorious historical adventure, and I just can't recommend it enough. At number 23, I have A Place Called Winter by Patrick Gale. This is a novel that I read quite a few years ago, but that has really stayed with me. And this is a story of a man who is living in Edwardian England, living a fairly conventional life, but has been kind of keeping his sexuality a secret. And after that secret kind of gets loose. He moves from England to Canada and starts a new life. It's about found family and so much more, and it's just an incredibly powerful novel. I really, really recommend it. At number 22, I have The Beholders by Hester Masson, and this is a proof copy. I'll put the final cover up on the screen as well. The Beholders is an incredible, thrilling, pacey novel set in the late Victorian period, and we're following a housemaid reading her diary as she works in a house that clearly has some secrets and some weird stuff happening. And we know from the beginning that the mistress of the house is going to be accused of killing her own child. This is one of those like wonderful works of historical fiction that has like massive thriller elements and is just so exciting and gripping to read. I thought the characterization was incredible. I thought this was so well paced and brilliant. And I also feel like it's a novel in diary form that really worked in diary form. Like diary form, I feel like sometimes feels a little bit forced, and it just absolutely felt natural and really worked in this book. I just really recommend this. I think it's an incredible novel. At number 21, I have The Chosen by Elizabeth Lowry, which is an incredible historical novel looking at Thomas Hardy, you know, the writer, real historical figure Thomas Hardy, in the days and weeks after the death of his wife. It's a book that looks at grief and also that examines this marriage in which there was just a complete kind of lack of understanding between these two people. It's so powerful and moving, so poignantly done, and I also feel like it strikes a really good balance with Thomas Hardy as a character. I feel like it would be so easy to have written this book in a way that painted Thomas Hardy as a monster and a really kind of unpleasant person, and that just wasn't what was done at all. It's done with such like humanity and precision and sympathy for all concerned, and I just really, really love The Chosen. So I really do recommend that one, and I think if you're interested in Thomas Hardy as a writer, as a historical figure, then it's absolutely worth the read. At number 20, I have The Dictionary of Lost Words by Pip Williams. This is a wonderful novel that spans from the late Victorian period through the Edwardian period, through the First World War, and looks at so many different historical events, chiefly focusing on the coming of age story of a girl called Esme, who spends a lot of her life thinking about dictionaries because her father is working on the Oxford English Dictionary, and while he is working on the Oxford English Dictionary, she starts to work on a dictionary of her own of the words that get left out of the dictionary, and often these are words that have significance only to social groups who are kind of not considered as important at this point in time. So she gathers together a lot of working class words and words that only women use and things like that. And meanwhile, we're following her through the suffragette movement and the First World War and so much more. And the amount that is packed into the Dictionary of Lost Words is kind of amazing, but also it just completely works. And I love it a lot. I didn't really get on so well with Pip Williams' next novel, The Bookbinder of Jericho, but I did really love the Dictionary of Lost Words and I definitely would recommend it. At number 19, I have Now We Should Be Entirely Free by Andrew Miller. This is an incredible novel set in the early 19th century in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. We are following a man who has come back from the wars, having been terribly affected by what he has seen, and meanwhile he is being chased and tracked down by someone who says that he did something terrible during the war. And so this book turns into this really tense chase narrative while also looking really fascinatingly at early 19th century society and the impact of the Napoleonic Wars on so many people. It also looks at disability in a really interesting way. Now that I'm talking about this book, I kind of feel like it should be higher up this list, but regardless, it's a wonderful book. I really, really do recommend it. I think this is a book that you'll probably like if you like authors like Robert Harris, and I also think it's a book you'll like if you like Jane Austen and you're kind of interested in the early 19th century, but you want to read about a very different side of it. And yeah, I just think it's incredible. At number 18, I have Small Island by Andrea Levy. This is an incredible work of historical fiction set before, during and after the Second World War. We're following two characters from Jamaica, two characters from Britain, what happens when the two characters from Jamaica move to Britain, how the lives of these four people interact. And I think this book looks at the Second World War and kind of post-war society so fascinatingly, as well as kind of like picking apart racism in kind of mid-20th century Britain in a way that is really complicated and impactful. And it's just such a great book. I really, really can't recommend Small Island enough. I feel like this is one of the books on the list I've read the longest time ago and haven't reread since. Like, I haven't read this book for 10 years, but it still has stayed with me so much. And yes, I really need to reread this one soon. At number 17, I have Affinity by Sarah Waters, a wonderful work of historical fiction set in the Victorian period, set around a woman's prison. We are following a young lady who is making kind of visits to this prison, and we are also following a prisoner and the kind of connection connection between them, but like all Sarah Waters books, is not exactly what you think, and there are lots of twists and turns, and it's just fantastic, as all Sarah Waters books are. To be honest, this is the only book by Sarah Waters I've put on this list, and it kind of could have been most of them. Like, I feel like all of Sarah Waters' books are so amazing, and Affinity is probably my favourite, but like, I love all of them a lot. I spoke about her more in the other video last week, so I don't need to go on for too long about this book here, but it is such a wonderful book. At number 16, I have Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi. This is the book I mentioned that could possibly be counted as a short story collection more than as a novel, but Homegoing basically follows a family and kind of their ancestors through time. So we start off, I think, in the late 18th century, possibly the early 19th century, with two sisters in Ghana. One of them is sold into slavery, one of them marries a slave trader, and then we follow their ancestors through the years in Ghana and then later in the USA. And each chapter, each story is kind of self-contained in its own right, but sometimes we also find out, you know, more about what happened to those people when we're following their children's story in the next chapter, and we kind of go all the way through to the present day. I think Homegoing is so incredible. I know it's one of those books that like a lot of people spoke about, and it had a lot of hype when it came out a few years ago, but I genuinely think all the hype is deserved. Okay, I've actually got through half my list in not very much over half an hour, so I think I'm going to keep going and try and talk about all the books in one video. I'm going to be more long-winded as I get to my like absolute favourite novels of all time, possibly, but you know, it's fine. Okay, at number 15, I have Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is an incredible novel about music set in the 1970s and follows the rise and fall of a band, and it's all told through interview transcripts. So I especially recommend listening to the audiobook, which is full cast and just fantastic. And in Daisy Jones and the Six, we're basically following the lives of these very complicated musicians, these messy characters, and we see everything from multiple perspectives. Everyone is an unreliable narrator. Lots of the characters are quite dislikable, but you also come to really understand and feel for them, and it's just fantastic. I just can't recommend it enough. At number 14, I have News of the Dead by James Robertson, a wonderful work of historical fiction. This is a multi-stranded book looking at the history of a fictional place called Glenconnock in Scotland, from the Anglo-Saxon period to 2020, 2021. Like, this is one of those books that is not just a work of historical fiction, but a book about history. And it's so good and so well done. And the way that it looks at kind of how we tell stories about the past, how we construct a sense of place and identity based on history. Like, that stuff in News of the Dead is just so fantastically explored. The kind of present day strand is set in kind of 2020, 2021 and looks at the COVID pandemic. And I think the way it kind of ties together like events of the pandemic with sort of like a war in the past, and various other like huge historical events, I think is so interestingly done, and I just love News of the Dead a lot. Now that I'm talking about News of the Dead, I feel like it should be higher up this list. I feel like because I have another book higher at this list that does kind of similar things with the way it looks at history, I feel like that has pushed News of the Dead down unfairly, but anyway, it doesn't matter. It's great. At number 13, I have The Whalebone Theatre by Joanna Quinn. This is an incredible novel that spans from the beginning of the 20th century through to the Second World War, following multiple generations of one family and how they are affected by various historical events, chiefly by the Second World War. It's interesting because The Whalebone Theatre, I feel like you don't reach the Second World War till about halfway through, but in many ways it is a novel about the Second World War. But we also look at kind of the relationships between this family, between these siblings especially, and it's so incredible, The Whalebone Theatre, as one of those kind of like slightly epic works of historical fiction that packs in so much, that looks at so many things with just incredible characterization, and a really poignant examination of the Second World War and looking at quite sort of different elements of the Second World War. You know, I feel like a lot of people feel like they have read a lot of books about the Second World War, but there are also lots of amazing novels that look at the Second World War in quite kind of a different way and from a different angle, and I just really recommend The Whalebone Theatre. I thought it was incredible. At number 12, I have Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. Now, this is the book that I mentioned earlier where I feel like whether this is a work of fantasy or a work of historical fiction or both is complicated, but I do think for me the like historical element of it is so important to what this book is that it feels like it is historical fiction to me, even though there is like a massive magical element here. So Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is set in a kind of alternative early 19th century during the Napoleonic Wars, in a world where there used to be magic, but magic more or less seems to have died out. There are people who call themselves magicians, but actually they are basically historians of magic. They don't practice magic, except for one man, Mr. Norrell, who does. And then another man, Jonathan Strange, emerges, who also is a practical magician. And in some way, this is a novel about two warring magicians, but in another way, it is a novel about early 19th century social concerns. And there is so much in this book about gender, race, and class, and about inequality within early 19th century society in Britain, and I just think it is so good. And there is so much I love here. It is a long book, but like, it's really worth it. I loved it so much. And number 11, I have Act of Oblivion by Robert Harris. This is an incredible novel set in 17th century England and America, looking at kind of the aftermath of the Restoration and looking at two men who were involved in the execution of Charles I. They are now considered criminals and they are being chased across England and America by a royalist. This book is so tense. Robert Harris is such a fantastic writer, and he writes a kind of like political historical thriller so well. And I feel like the complexities of the characterization in this book is so great, because there were so many dislikable characters and so many characters whose views were just like completely alien to mine. But I also feel like Robert Harris does such a good job of making you understand them and making you invest in them. And the ending of this book is just like incredible. Like, I think this book has one of the best endings of any book that I've ever read, in its subtlety and gloriousness. I can't explain why it's so good, but it is. And yes, I just love Act of Oblivion a lot. At number 10, I have Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon. Now, this is a book I read very recently, and I don't know whether this book is so high because it has recency bias, or whether I've even like been ungenerous to it in my recency bias and it actually should be higher, because I do think Glorious Exploits is one of the best books I have ever read, and it is an incredible work of historical fiction. So Glorious Exploits is set in ancient Sicily after a failed invasion by the Athenians, and we are following two out-of-work Sicilian potters who entertain themselves by going to the quarries to visit the Athenian prisoners of war. One of them is obsessed with Athenian drama, and so they decide they're going to put on a play using the Athenian prisoners of war as their actors. And everything goes on from there. And it is a book about power and the dehumanizing effects of war and so much more. And it has such complicated, clever characterization and such a complicated look at its themes. And it's also written gloriously in such a clever way. Ferdia Lennon is an Irish writer, and Glorious Exploits is written in a very like Irish style and turn of phrase. It is, of course, set in ancient Sicily, but they would all be speaking Greek. Pretty sure they would be speaking Greek. Pretty sure I said in a previous video that they would all be speaking Latin, but I'm pretty sure they would have been speaking Greek anyway. So, you know, if they're all speaking Greek and you're writing the book in English, why shouldn't they be speaking whichever variety of English you want them to be speaking? But the writing style just like works perfectly. And I especially recommend listening to the audiobook, which Ferdia Lennon narrates himself in a fantastic way. Glorious Exploits is so funny and so brutal and tragic and smart, and I just think I have very rarely read a book as good as Glorious Exploits. Like, I know I've put this at number 10 on this list, but like, if I think about it objectively, is it the best book on this list? Do I think that? I don't know. But it's so good. At number 9, I have Once Upon a River by Diane Setterfield. This is set in the Victorian period and looks at various characters who are all kind of tied together by the River Thames, and also by an accident that happens one day on the river that introduces two new people to this neighbourhood, one of whom is a small child, and no one quite knows how she arrived here. Nobody knows who she is, but various people kind of lay claim to her, and we kind of follow everything that goes on from there. This book is so powerful and beautifully written. I love Diane Setterfield a lot. This book looks at the power of storytelling and looks at kind of Victorian society in such a complicated, amazing way. There are so many fantastic elements in this book. There are so many ways to interpret what's going on here. You know, is there a magical explanation? Is there a practical explanation? And I really do recommend this book a lot. At number 8, I have The Kingdoms by Natasha Pulley. This is a wonderful, complicated, glorious novel. Oh, I just love Natasha Pulley so much. Of course I do. Natasha Pulley and Diane Setterfield are the two authors who have two books on this list because, you know, I just couldn't help myself. So The Kingdoms begins in an alternative 19th century where the French won the Napoleonic Wars. We're following a man called Joe, and through various circumstances, he ends up getting sent to a lighthouse to work there. And at this lighthouse, strange things start to happen. I kind of don't want to tell you anything more than that. The Kingdoms is so complicated and glorious and fun. And it has a lot of complexities to it. It looks at memory in a really powerful way. It looks at time and history in a complicated way. The central relationship and all of the characterization in it is so complicated and clever. And it's one of those books you just have to read. It's so good. It's so good. At number 7, I have Miss Austen by Jill Hornby. Not about Jane Austen, but about Jane Austen's sister Cassandra. We're chiefly following her in the 1840s, quite a long time after her sister Jane Austen has died. But we're also seeing her looking back on her life, on the time when Jane Austen was alive, on her youth. And the book is in many ways about grief, as well as being about kind of the importance of unimportant people, I suppose. And it's beautiful, it's poignant, it's clever, it's so emotional and so amazing. And I think especially if you're someone who knows a little bit about Jane Austen's life, the way this book looks at certain myths surrounding Jane Austen and her family is just so well done. And I just love this book so much. And I think it is one of the most beautiful novels ever written. At number 6, I have Briefly a Delicious Life by Nell Stevens. This is a wonderful, wacky, weird novel set in the early 19th century in Mallorca, when the real historical figures George Sand and Frédéric Chopin arrive and stay for a while with their family in a monastery. Little do they know that this monastery is haunted by a 15th century ghost called Blanca, whose perspective this novel is told in. So we are following the story of Frédéric Chopin and George Sand, but narrated by a teenage ghost who died a very long time ago, who is observing them and kind of falling in love with George Sand. And it's so weird, but it's so good. I love the conceit and the ghostliness and the sort of ability Blanca has as a ghost to look into people's heads. I love the way this book looks at music. I love the way it looks at complicated relationships. I love the way it looks at bisexuality. And although there are some sad and messy, complicated things in this book, it's also just such an utter delight to read because it's so weird, but it also just really works. And I loved it a lot. At number 5, I have Cuddy by Benjamin Myers. This is a book I read last year and completely fell in love with. This, a bit like News of the Dead by James Robertson, is a book that is really about history, and we're following a place through various points in time. So this book kind of begins in the Anglo-Saxon period, shortly after the death of St Cuthbert, also known as Cuddy. And then we move through time from the 14th century to the 17th to the 19th to the 21st century, following various different people who are all kind of connected by Durham as a place and by Durham Cathedral as a building, and by the legacy of St Cuthbert. There are chapters told in poetry, there are chapters made up entirely of quotes from other sources, there are chapters in diary form, in play form. The form of Cuddy is quite experimental, but I do think it's a very accessible book, and it really looks so powerfully at storytelling and history and how history is constructed through storytelling. But also each individual section you end up really invested in, and the final section that's set in the present day I found so emotional, and I just thought this was just amazing all round. Just such a good book. For me, a historical fiction book just has to be set in the past, but there are some books that are set in the past and there are some books that are about history, and Cuddy is one of those books that is about history and about how we construct history and how we examine the past through narrative, and I just love it so much. At number 4, I have The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. This book is set primarily in the 1950s, but we also spend time in the 1930s and the kind of interwar period. And in the 1950s, we're following a butler called Stevens, who has been given some time off work after a new employer has come into the house that he's worked at for a very long time. He's been a butler all his life, but this is the 1950s. Big houses are starting to no longer be such of a thing, and he's starting to feel a lack of purpose in his life now that he is getting older. And so he spends his time off kind of driving around England, thinking back on his life and his experiences, especially on his experiences between the wars and about his relationship with another member of staff. The way this book looks at memory is just amazing, and I just think it's one of the most kind of poignant, beautiful books ever written. And I love it so much. I should reread this one soon. Yes, I really, really do recommend this book a lot. Now, at number 3, I have The 30th Tale by Diane Setfield. Now, The 30th Tale is my favourite modern novel. It's my favourite book that's not from the 19th century. But I have weirdly put this at number 3 in terms of my favourite historical fiction, because I feel like while I love everything about this book, I don't love this book because it is a work of historical fiction. I do think it is a work of historical fiction. Like, there is definitely a big historical element in this book, and it does play a part, but I feel like this book is primarily not a work of historical fiction, in that it is not primarily concerned with its historical setting, if that makes sense. So I was basically umming and ahhing about where this book should go on this list. I think the last time I made a list of like my favourite historical fiction, I didn't include The 30th Tale because I was like, is it really historical fiction? But like, it's really hard to say that it isn't historical fiction. But I also feel like to declare it my favourite work of historical fiction, when I don't think its primary purpose is to be a work of historical fiction, is complicated. So anyway, does that make any sense? Probably not, only to me. It's fine. The 30th Tale is a story within a story. So we start in the present day-ish, but quite ambiguously, at some point probably in the late 20th century, with a biographer going to visit a famous novelist. She is there to write Vida Winter's biography, and Vida Winter starts to tell her the story of her life, which probably takes place in the early 20th century, but it's quite unclear. Time is quite nebulous in this book. A large sections of it are definitely set in the past, but when in the past, how long ago in the past, is quite complicated. And I kind of love that about it. Like, it has a quite like fairy tale quality to it. And I also think there are small clues about when it is set that I quite like piecing together. I love The 30th Tale for so many reasons. It is a book about storytelling and a book about books and a book about the love of books, and I love that. But it's also a story about memory and truth, and about the unreliability of memory, as well as about kind of unreliable narrators, and I always love that in books. It's a book that I first read as a teenager and just completely fell in love with, and I haven't stopped thinking about it since, basically. I think it is so good and so clever and so twisty and like well paced and perfectly plotted, with fantastic characterization and themes, and I just absolutely love it a lot. But I feel like, of all the millions of reasons why I love The 30th Tale, the way it looks at history isn't really one of them, which is why it's at number 3, not at number 1. However, it is one of my favourite books ever written, so there we go. And number 2, I have The Watchmaker of Filigree Street by Natasha Pulley, which is a wonderful, wonderful work of historical fiction set in the late 19th century, mostly in Britain, with a few little bits in Japan. And this book has a bit of a speculative element, but I would say that the speculative element is almost more about the themes than it is about the plot, although it does have a role in the plot to play. This book follows a man called Nathaniel who works in the civil service, and various circumstances lead him to befriend and become the lodger of a Japanese watchmaker who lives on Filigree Street in London. And we kind of follow the connections between these two people, as well as following a woman called Grace who wants to be a scientist, but is being pushed by her father into the marriage market. And there's just so much going on in The Watchmaker of Filigree Street, and I love all of it. It's so delightful and fun and quirky and joyous, but also so clever and poignant. And this book is basically one of those books that just like does everything I want it to do, and that is just like so precision engineered to my taste. And it's also the first book by Natasha Pulley I ever read. I read this book like in one day when I first read it, and had the most glorious reading experience, and I just love this book so much and think about it so much, and I'm so like emotionally invested and emotionally attached to the characters in this novel, like so emotionally attached to the characters in this novel. And I just love The Watchmaker of Filigree Street so much, and I think it is incredible, and yes, second favourite work of historical fiction. And actually, maybe I love The Watchmaker of Filigree Street more than I love the book I put at number 1. Maybe I do. But I feel like the book I put at number 1 is both one of my absolute favourite books of the 30 books in this video, but it's also like one of the ones that engages with history in a way that I love. and that is The Wonder by Emma Donoghue. So The Wonder is set in the 19th century in Ireland, and we're following a nurse who has come to this small Irish village in order to observe a young girl who people are claiming is staying alive without food, and they are claiming that it is a miracle, a wonder, and this nurse is set to watch her and see whether or not this is true. And this book is so intense and so clever and so masterfully written, and I just think about it all the time. I should reread it actually, because I've only read it once, whereas like the other 3 books in my top 4 I have read more than once. But anyway, The Wonder engages really fascinatingly with this point in history. It has such clever characterization, it has such amazing writing, the way it looks at like the history of medicine and religion and how science and religion interact or don't, and the way that it looks at the various like bonds formed within this novel. It's just incredible, and it was such an intense, amazing reading experience. And I just think this book is amazing. And like I said, do I love The 13th Tale and The Watchmaker of Thurgood Street more than I love The Wonder? Like emotionally, maybe, but I feel like as a work of pure historical fiction, The Wonder is just so good and so what I love. So those are 30 works of historical fiction. How long have we been filming for? Only just over an hour, so I'm pretty pleased with that. I feel like this video will be quite long, but not as long as it might have been. So I hope you have enjoyed hearing about 30 amazing historical fiction books. Do let me know down in the comments, have you read any of these books? What did you think of them? What are your absolute favourite works of historical fiction? So yes, I hope you have enjoyed this video. I've definitely enjoyed making it and revisiting some of my absolute favourite works of historical fiction and thinking about, you know, some books I really want to reread at some point soon. So that's all for now. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video. At number 8, I have The Kingdoms by Natasha. That's not the right book.